Peter Pan and Wendy by J.M Barrie. Retold by May Byron. Chapter 3. A Strange Disappearance. The three little darlings were peacefully asleep. They heard neither Nana nor the star. They never saw their 3 night lights blink and go out one after another. Still less did they see the extraordinary light that was darting and dashing about the room, hunting in every drawer and cupboard, hole and corner, searching for Peter's shadow. This light, which was like a ball of fire when it moved, was a fairy when it stood still. It was a fairy girl, about as long as one's hand, dressed in a delicate skeleton leaf. Whenever she spoke, she made a lovely tinkling noise like little golden bells. For this reason, she was called Tinkerbell. After she had flashed all round the place, she disappeared into a jug. The next moment, Peter Pan dropped in through the open window. He knew his way about very well, you see, but Tinkerbell, whom he had had to carry, had never been in a nursery before. She found it extremely interesting, especially the jug. "Tink, where are you?" Peter whispered softly. "Tink, have you found where they have put my shadow?" She answered him in a tinkling fairy language. "Yes, it's on the big box," by which she meant the chest of drawers. They both rushed at the chest. Peter pulled out his shadow and unrolled it in such haste that he never noticed he had left Tinkerbell shut up in the drawer where it had been. He thought his shadow would hurry to join itself onto him again, but it didn't. It did not indeed seem to recognize him at all, and kept aloof. Perhaps being rolled up had affected it in some way. He got some soap from the bathroom and tried to stick it on with that, but it slithered off again. Peter sat down and sobbed. Fancy recovering one's shadow only to find that it could do without you. The sound of his weeping wakened Wendy. She sat up and inquired politely, "Why are you crying, little boy?" Peter, who had lovely manners when he liked, jumped up and made a beautiful bow to Wendy. She returned it as well as she could in bed. He asked her, "What's your name?" "Wendy Moira Angela Darling," she replied, feeling that this sounded very nice. "What's your name?" "Peter Pan." It sounded too short after hers. Both of them noticed that. Wendy wanted to know where he lived, and he told her. "Second turn to the right, and then straight on till morning." "What a funny address," said Wendy. "I mean, is that what they put on your letters, or on your mother's letters?" Peter explained that he had no letters, and no mother, and no shadow. At least, the shadow wouldn't stick on. When Wendy discovered that he had been trying to fix it with soap, she was inclined to laugh. "It must be sewn on, of course," she said, and she got out of bed, fetched her work-basket, and sewed the shadow onto his feet. This hurt a bit, of course, but Peter was soon jumping about in wild delight, crowing with conceitedness, and boasting, "Oh, the cleverness of me!" as if he had put the shadow on by himself. "Well," exclaimed Wendy, shocked. "Of all the cocky, conceited boys, of course I did nothing." "Oh, you did a little, perhaps," he answered carelessly. "A little," repeated Wendy, and she returned to her bed in a dignified manner, covering up her head with the blankets. Peter was rather alarmed. He told her that he couldn't help crowing when he was pleased with himself, and that one girl was more use than 20 boys. This melted Wendy's heart. She came out of the blankets again and sat with Peter on the side of the bed. She also offered to give him a kiss if he liked, and Peter held out his hand for it. Wendy saw at once that the poor boy had never had a kiss. So not to hurt his feelings, she took off her thimble and put it on his finger. He was ever so pleased. "Now shall I give you a kiss?" he asked, and he dropped into her hand an acorn button off his coat. Wendy fastened it onto the little chain she wore round her neck. It was a hard sort of kiss, but so was her thimble. "How old are you, Peter?" she said. This was a most uncomfortable question for him. I don't know," he stammered, "but quite young, anyhow. You see, Wendy, I ran away the day I was born because I heard my father and mother talking about what I was to be when I grew up." "Dear, dear," said Wendy. "He must have been a very brave baby," she thought. "I don't want to grow up ever," he continued excitedly. "I don't want to be a man. I want to stay a little boy and have fun. That's why I ran away and lived with the fairies in Kensington Gardens." Wendy was intensely interested. Imagine talking to a boy who knew fairies. She asked so many questions about fairies that Peter was astonished, for he found them rather commonplace, and indeed sometimes they were such a nuisance he had to spank them. He did his best, however, to give her all possible information. "You see, Wendy," he said, "when the first baby laughed for the first time, its laugh broke into 1,000 pieces, and they all went skipping about, and that was the beginning of fairies. But there aren't many of them now. They're mostly dead. It's because children have left off believing in them, you know. Every time a child says, 'I don't believe in fairies,' another fairy somewhere falls down dead." Here Peter suddenly remembered Tinkerbell. Could she have fallen down dead? She was certainly very quiet. "I can't think where she has gone to. Tink! Tink!" And he looked about for her. "You don't mean to say there's a fairy in this room?" cried Wendy, clutching his arm. "Well, she was here just now," said Peter. They both looked and listened. A tiny tinkle of bells came from the chest of drawers, and Peter burst into a gurgle of laughter. "Oh, Wendy," he whispered, "I do believe I shut up poor Tink in the drawer." He let Tink out, and she flew about the room perfectly wild with fury. "I'm sorry," said Peter, "but how could I know you were in the drawer?" Tink dashed to and fro in a fearful passion, and at last settled down a moment upon the cuckoo clock, so that Wendy saw her and cried out, "Oh, the lovely! What is she saying, Peter?" "She's not in a good temper," he explained. "She says that she is my fairy, and that you are a great ugly girl." "Oh," said Wendy, distressed. "But you're talking nonsense, Tink," said Peter. "You know you are. You can't be my fairy, because I am a gentleman, and you are a lady." Tink replied, "You silly ass," and vanished into the bathroom. Peter apologized for her bad behavior. "She is quite a common fairy," he told Wendy. "She doesn't know any better. She is called Tinkerbell because she mends the pots and kettles." This was something he had just invented. Fortunately, Tink did not hear it. "Then, Peter," said Wendy, "where do you live now? In Kensington Gardens?" "Well, sometimes I do, but mostly I live with the lost boys." "Who are they?" "Why, the children who fall out of their perambulators when the nurses are looking another way. If nobody claims them in 7 days, they are sent to the Neverland. I'm captain of them." "What fun!" exclaimed Wendy. "Then, Peter, why do you come here to our nursery window?" She hoped he would answer, "To see you," but he said it was to listen to her mother's stories. It's the same reason that makes swallows build in the eaves of houses. They are eavesdroppers. "None of the lost boys had mothers," Peter went on, "and none of them knew any stories, except what Peter overheard and brought back. And he only brought scrappity bits, just shreds and patches of fairy tales picked up by eavesdropping." But when Wendy remarked that she knew lots of stories, and she told him the end of Cinderella just to show him, Peter was struck by a dazzlingly bright idea. He proposed that she should come back with him to the Neverland and tell her stories to the lost boys, and darn their clothes, and make pockets for them, and tuck them in at night, and, in short, mother the lost boys properly. Anybody who has ever had a mother like Mrs. Darling will understand at once how this notion tempted Wendy. She saw that she could be a sort of Mrs. Darling No. 2. And Peter went farther still. Oh, but he was artful. He promised to teach her to fly, to show her real mermaids with tails. He also mentioned pirates. John and Michael were awake by this time, listening with all their ears. They insisted on having a flying lesson at once. But at this point, everybody had to hide behind the window curtains, for Liza entered in a very bad temper, dragging Nana with her. She had been making Christmas puddings in the kitchen, but Nana kept up such a miserable barking that Liza had brought her to the nursery, just to see for herself everything was all right. "There," she said angrily, "they're perfectly safe. Lights out, and every one of the little dears sound asleep. Listen to their gentle breathing." Here Michael overdid his gentle breathing and made it so loud that it was plainly a pretence. Nana knew that sort of breathing. She tried to pull herself away from Liza, but Liza sternly marched her downstairs again, tied her up, and returned to the Christmas puddings. The unhappy dog was determined to rescue the children from the danger she felt was somewhere near. She strained and strained at her chain until it broke, and in another minute she was bursting into the dining room of number 27, where she knew her master and mistress had gone, with her paws flung up and an expression of despair. Mr. and Mrs. Darling saw at once that there was something dreadful happening at home. They didn't wait to say goodbye to their friends. They rushed out and followed Nana to number 14. Meanwhile, Peter had taught the 3 children to fly after a fashion. At first they were decidedly clumsy. They would never be so elegant as Peter, who had been flying all his life. But he blew some fairy dust on them, and soon they flew quite well enough for young beginners. Round and round the room they went. It was quicker and easier every time. Mr. and Mrs. Darling, staring up at the nursery window as they ran along the street with Nana, saw 3 little figures in night clothes circling round the room in a blaze of light. No, there were 4 figures. Oh dear, what did it mean? Before the distracted parents could reach the nursery door, 3 things had happened. Peter had mentioned mermaids and pirates again. The stars had blown the windows open, and the 4 little figures had soared out into the night. Peter went first. Michael and Wendy followed. John was last because he had stopped to put on his Sunday hat. Mr. and Mrs. Darling and the dog Nana rushed into the deserted nursery, just one moment too late.